Professor Jay Lund is Vice Director of the Center for Watershed Sciences. Sorry about that. Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Environmental Engineering and Geography at University of California, Davis, and for quite a while has been one of the most important voices in California water. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Lund.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Just as a reminder, a distinguished professor is just a couple of letters away from being an extinguished professor. I'm here to talk about successes and failures in California water. We live in an age where people like to talk about failures, and as we should. But I think it's also important to talk about successes and how do you go from failures to successes, because that's where we want to be. This is a very brief summary of a huge subject on California water. California is a very tough neighborhood when it comes to water. Water problems of all different shapes and sizes and forms. And it's also famous both for its successes and its failures in water management. So I'd like to briefly go through some of California's greatest successes and failures in managing water, followed by what I see as some of our, four of our greatest challenges, and some lessons on how to make successes from failures, because that's what really we should be devoting ourselves to. On successes, I think we have two major ones, really. First is urban water supply and wastewater for large cities, for the most part, and even medium-sized cities. Almost everyone in California and in large and even most small systems can drink water from the tap. By historical and global standards, this is an amazing accomplishment. Our water demands have changed over time. We've gone from rivers and wells and reservoirs to interties between these systems with major water imports from across the state and even from other states, water conservation, conjunctive use, water markets. So I think the first big success we should acknowledge is that for certainly almost more than 95% of the people in California, we have a very successful water supply system, and a very safe one by global standards and historical standards. The second big accomplishment, success we've had, is agricultural water supply. California has about 3 or 4% maybe of its economy and of its employment are in agriculture. It's a lot more in some parts of the state, but on average across the state, it's only about 2 or 3% of the economy and the employment. It has a huge, prosperous agricultural sector. It might be small in terms of the total California economy, but in terms of global standards and contributions to the national economy, it really does quite well. It's certainly the most important agricultural state in the nation. Very highly varied forms of agriculture and crops production. We grow actually the more healthy foods in general, and quite a variety. We have 400 different commercial crops in California, which is just amazing. And to do all of this agriculture in a climate like California's, with this huge long dry season and tremendous variability between years of wet and dry, is really quite an accomplishment in terms of infrastructure and water management and institutions and even law. There's always improvements that need to be made and can be made, but it's been very successful. And just like in urban water supply successes, the successes of agricultural water supply have changed over time. We began by just taking water out of streams directly with no reservoirs and very little in the way of conveyance and canal systems, and taking water out of in wells. And we've added, tremendous canal systems, ability to import and store water, ability to do what we call conjunctive use, which is to store surface water underground during wet years, and then use those wells, that groundwater, more during dry years. In recent years, we've also had a lot of water markets where farmers that have lower value crops can sell their water to other farmers that have higher value crops during droughts, as a way of keeping the prosperity of the region up and compensating the farmers that sell for their losses. So it's been a very civilizing influence, water markets, although they're not perfect, as nothing in California water is perfect. Those are the two big successes, and I think by global standards, historical standards, they're really quite amazing. And like most successes, they are imperfect. Now let me touch on two major failures. The first real major failure is ecosystems. Our ecosystems in California, certainly the aquatic ecosystems, are quite a mess. We have very extensive land and water development, which has very deeply disrupted and destroyed a lot of native ecosystems. We have a tremendous number of species on the endangered species list. We're going to have some more, I think, before we take many more off. This is partly the price of success in the agricultural sector, as most of the water and much of the land has been devoted to agriculture. It came out of ecosystems, but it's also an area where we've really not organized ourselves or funded ourselves well to be successful in managing for ecosystems. We've had some better success in ecosystems for waterfowl than for fish. Waterfowl, over the last 50 years or more, the different groups have the private duck hunters and the state and federal waterfowl agencies have sort of gotten together over time and established a series of migratory refuges up and down the state. So that is probably our biggest success on the ecosystem side, but it's not been as great as we would like, and it's been it mostly just gives us a little bit of hope that maybe we can do better for fish sometime in the future. The other big failure, I think, in the state for water management is poor small communities. The larger communities we do pretty well with because we have all the economies of scale, and we can manage water supplies quite well for fairly large cities and even small cities. But if they're small and poor communities, then they don't have much money and there's not many economies of scale, and they're not so well organized for the problem. These systems also have a lot of water quality problems, in addition to the financial aspects, mostly nitrate coming from our successes in agriculture. So we have a lot of, in rural areas, we have a lot of nitrate contamination of small rural water systems and domestic wells in rural areas. And that's probably going to expand considerably in the coming years, coming decades. These poor rural communities have also had problems with declining groundwater levels, stranded wells, dry wells. Certainly our Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which people are struggling to implement, is going probably better than expected to address some of the declining groundwater levels, but we're also going to have other problems that way. For these small communities, these are not unique problems to California. Pretty much every state, if you talk to its public health officials and ask which communities have problems with drinking water supplies, they will mostly be small rural water systems that sort of lack the economies of scale and the kind of and have funding and management and organization problems along with them. So those are two successes and two failures. To go after those, I'd like to sort of phrase the conversation into a series of 4 challenging areas. And the first of which I think has got to be ecosystems. Our management of ecosystems is, we've tried pretty hard for the last 30 or 40 years, maybe 50 years in somewhat senses, but it's still mostly a mess. We're not really organized to be successful on this. We haven't been able to unite local government and state and federal governments and private interests and NGOs into an effective alliance to address these problems, as we did long ago for large urban and agricultural problems. So we're not going to need to consider ourselves a little more seriously on how we can do something more than the ineffective stuff we've done so far. I think a primary problem is that we're organizing our ecosystem work around endangered species. And not that endangered species are unimportant by any means, but we need to figure out how to start on these problems before these species end up in the intensive care unit. And certainly in our human health, when if you end up in the intensive care unit, you might have been better served by going into primary care first. Second big challenge we have, which I think we're making more progress on, is groundwater. Not only groundwater quantity and land subsidence and the declining groundwater levels, but also quite a lot on groundwater quality. Sigma has done a pretty good job of putting us on a much more sustainable path, and we're going to have to. We have a long way to go. It's going to be a hard way to solve this problem, but it's moving ahead pretty well, better than I expected actually. But then once we get the groundwater quantity problem roughly addressed, we're going to start seeing that the groundwater quality problems, particularly salinity and nitrate contamination in groundwater, is going to be something that's even harder to address. Sigma is going to give us a lot of benefits. It's going to have a lot of collateral benefits in terms of forcing us all to do our water accounting a little bit more seriously and diligently, and that's going to have uses for surface water and ecosystems as well. So that's nice. Third problem is Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. All the water problems in California tend to accumulate in a couple of places. And one of those places is the Delta. They also tend to accumulate in groundwater, but surface water manifestation of this is the Delta. And it also, like ecosystems, they're changing faster than we're able to adapt to it. Fourth area is, not surprisingly, our other big failure, which is small communities. Poor small communities. Every state has these problems. California has a lot of these problems. In the last decade or so, we seem to have been taking these problems more seriously, and I think we're on a path to doing better with them, but it's going to be a persistent problem, and we really need to keep going after it. The problems there are not just the water. Usually these poor communities have a whole host of problems that needs to be addressed. All of these problems involve climate change. So I don't want to highlight climate change as a separate challenge, but the challenges of climate change will be seen in all of our successes and all of our failed areas. So how can we learn from the past, these successes and our failures, to build successes from failures? Certainly in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, late 1800s, you could have seen our urban drinking water systems and our agricultural systems as failures. They did much more poorly than they are now. So what are some lessons that we can take from this history of successes for making our current failures into maybe less failures at least, and hopefully in some ways successes? The first, I think, lesson is that progress always lies between complacency and panic. If we panic about a problem, we don't usually organize ourselves very effectively. And if we're complacent about a problem, well, we don't organize ourselves at all to make improvements. In all of these problems, it also takes persistence, perseverance in problem solving, and being between complacency and panic is really how you make progress. So that's the first big lesson. Don't give up and keep trying to make things better. The second lesson, I think, is successful solutions are mostly local and regional in their finance, governance, and implementation. If you look at who pays for our successes, who pays the money, who organizes the implementation of our successes, they're mostly local and regional. And there's some good reasons for that, because the people that see the problems, have the problems, are in charge of governance and paying for it. If you expect someone else to organize and solve your problems, you're probably not going to be so happy with the solutions. The local and regional efforts are also supported by really important requirements, regulations, and sometimes genuine technical and financial assistance from state and federal agencies and law. So I think it's important to note that the state and federal government aren't just problems for local water management. Sometimes the state and local governments provide technical support and regulations that sort of force local and regional governments to move along and improve things. Certainly our wastewater treatment system, which is also a part of our successes, would not have been as successful without state and federal legislation and inspections and technical assistance. A third lesson, I think, is portfolio approaches to action in institutions. If you have a portfolio of solutions that you're orchestrating and bringing together, you have a much greater diversity and much more adaptive set of tools to address these problems. And historically, that's been a very good way to have more adaptability in our management of water, as well as improving the reliability and lower the costs, and involving more people in the management of water systems. A fourth lesson, I think, is the need to adapt to variability and change. California has a lot of droughts and floods. We have to manage our water system for both. We're never sure the next year what it's going to be. So you have to be prepared for a range of things happening the next year. This also, I think, has helped California, as its economy has changed, as its water demands have changed over time, adapt to those changes, particularly in the urban and agricultural sectors. And to have institutions that learn and can adapt to these changes and can work well together. That's sometimes a problem. From all this, I think we actually know how to be successful. We have examples of successes in water management in California, but sometimes it is politically inconvenient or too much trouble to do this. And it can often take decades to arrange more successful solutions. We've certainly seen this in history of the big water projects in California, where it took really quite a few decades for them to become organized to be successful in the ways that they are successful. So it should not surprise us that it will take decades for us to be successful in the current areas of failure. But there's hope. And then I have some further readings. So for those of you that are interested in this subject and you'd like to read some more, let me share my screen if I can. You see that? Okay, these are my notes. And then at the bottom, I don't know if you can see this. Is that readable, Dennis? Further readings?
Yes. And we can put the whole, we can talk about accessing this or the whole note.
I can send you an updated version of the notes if you want to put it up along with it. So there it is. California's successes and failures and some lessons for the future in a mercifully short period of time.
Okay, well, Thank you, Professor Lund. We actually have a little bit of time for discussion and questions and further elucidation. Yeah, as I said, we will put the at least the recommended reading. I saw there was a Mark Aricks um, on, which is always a good read, and he's actually just even in terms of a stylist, he's a very good writer,
Oh, yes.
and you know, so I'd basically read whatever he was writing about.
He has had a couple of books on California water, and they're both been very good.
Yeah, and really gives a good feel for living in the valley to you know, so I mean he really does get
He did
that.
a marvelous job at showing how um, this is really a human system. Our water management system is a system of humans with all of our um, glories and foibles.
And would you want to comment on now? I mean, these, you know, definitely are kind of the broad brushstrokes. And I think I wrote a little note about, you know, kind of a continuum of complacency and panic. And one thing we'll have later on in Waterpalooza is actually one of the issues that came out of the panic, which in the drought of 2014, for instance, which was a green lighting of artificial turf as a water saving measure, and not one of the best panic decisions, considering its toxicity, actually,
Yeah, that's right.
and in terms of runoff, and you know, besides all the other fun stuff like injuries and things, uh, but from a water treatment standpoint, it's not very good at all. But there, in terms of I guess my question is with kind of emerging. I know on the federal level, there's been talking about how the Clean Water Act needs to be reformed. Well, but I mean, by reform, I think some of the people talking about it looks to be like substitute the word abolished. But within California, uh, obviously there's, would you care to get further into the Delta planning? I mean, you know, the single pipe, just where we are at with,
Well, there's this long-term, essentially permanent climatologic geographic imbalance between Northern and Southern California in terms of where the water and the people are and where the water and the people ain't. Um, there's an old story I heard that um, Edmund Brown, governor, um, once said that it's probably better for Northern California to have some of Northern California's water go south than to have all the people in Southern California go north. And so I think that's just kind of we have, in order for us to be successful as humans on the planet, to be as prosperous as we are, we have to trade with each other, right? I drive a car that wasn't made in California. California makes some things that go elsewhere. Um, so a good bit of my salary comes from the taxpayers of my pension now comes from the taxpayers of Southern California. Um, so we all have to get along. We're all better off because we trade water and oil and iPads and computer technology and electrons. and services all over the world and all over the state. So I think it's mostly a matter of keeping it reasonable.
At this point too, I usually, at some point during Waterpalooza, I point to that, especially to a Bay Area audience, I point to the pretty much equal level of water imports from the Sierra, from the Bay Area to the LA basin.
Actually, the San Francisco area is probably one of the most water importing parts of the state. Very little of the Bay Area's urban water use comes from the Bay Area. Otherwise, your water will be very expensive, desalinated water.
Yes, and we're definitely talking about I guess it's even well, desal out of the bay. I mean, there's brackish,
Yeah,
but then
so I guess there is a plant in Antioch that's somewhere under construction, or was
Newark
Newark
at the
too.
bottom
Okay.
of the bay has actually has a brackish desal plant. It's been in operation for a while, and it was very quietly done. It was a real kind of scoop to have it on a Waterpalooza a couple years ago.
Oh, great.
But there's, yeah, and so there is going to be further discussion about different options in terms of alternate water options as well. But I think that's an interesting takeaway from your talk as well, is the trade issue in general, and then specifically with water. So thank you for that. Well, anyway, thanks for making yourself available and battling those microphone issues, and starting off day 2 of Waterpalooza.
Thank you very much. Hope it's helpful. Have a good event.